Good evening, everyone. If you could make your way to your seats. So sorry the music stopped. My name is Brady McGee, and I'm the Officer of Next Generation here at the Council. It is my pleasure to welcome you this evening to our Young Professionals program discussing gentrification, the good, the bad, and those hipsters. We're in for a lively discussion tonight, and I'm really happy that you all have made it out to join us. Most of you know the house rules, but for our guests and newcomers, tonight's program is on the record and being live streamed. So we ask that you please silence your phones, but you can keep them out and at the ready as we'll be taking questions through our online survey technology, the link to which you can find on the screens on either side of me. Simply type chi.cnf.io into your device browser, and you can select tonight's program to submit a question for consideration. We very much welcome your engagement with us on social media, encourage you to quote, post pictures, and use hashtag CouncilYP in your posts. As you're tweeting, though, know that views expressed by individuals we host are their own and do not represent institutional positions or views of the Council. While you have your calendars out, please let me make mention of the very last program of the Council year. Our highly anticipated annual YP Pub Quiz will take place June 28th at Buddy Guy's Legends. Gather your friends for a fun night of high drama, stiff competition, and most importantly, a chance to stake your claim as the most globally fluent young professionals in Chicago. So I hope to see you there. For nearly a century, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs has provided an independent, nonpartisan platform for a variety of different voices to promote deeper global understanding and active U.S. engagement in the world. We engage not only the nation and world's top leaders, but also Chicago's next generation of leaders, with programming to increase your global fluency and cultural competence. I encourage you, if you're not yet a member with us, and I know there are a lot of new folks in the audience tonight, to consider joining the Council as a member and participating in our Young Professionals Network. To find out more information about how you can join, you can either see me or our YP ambassadors. They'll be in the back of the room at the conclusion of the program. Back to tonight's program. With most of the world's population soon to exist in cities and urban revitalization booming across the world's most sought-after millennial living cities, sociologists, developers, and community activists are all musing in the public square about the costs and the gains of gentrification. But what actually is gentrification? Is it a dirty word or a dog whistle for impeding residential racism? Or a trumpet for the turning of dilapidation of historically under-resourced cities across America and the globe? To unbox some of the many factors surrounding this phenomenon, we have a wonderful panel of experts. To introduce them briefly, Tim Swanson is the Chief Design Officer at Skinder, where he leads both architects and designers on design integration. Tim has lived and worked in Abu Dhabi, rural India, New York, and now Chicago. He holds a Master's of Architecture with a specialization in urban development and infill from the University of Illinois at Chicago and bachelor's degrees in fine arts and economics from Colgate University. Marissa Navarra is the Vice President of the Metropolitan Planning Council. She designs and manages the Council's multi-year cost of segregation project in Chicago. Marissa holds master's degrees from the University of Chicago and Istituto Politecnico di Milano, and received her bachelor's at University of Michigan. Guian Foreman is the executive director of the Greater Southwest Development Corporation. He previously was the managing partner of McTubb Development, focused on inner city development, and Guian holds an MBA from the University of Chicago Booth School of Business and received his bachelor's degree from Florida A&M University. Moderating tonight's discussion is Taylor Marr. Taylor is a senior economist and data scientist at Redfin. There, he analyzes and reports on trends in housing affordability, urban planning, and migration patterns in the U.S., with special attention on the living trends of millennials. Taylor holds a master's in international and development economics from the University of Applied Sciences in Berlin and a Bachelor of Science from the University of South Dakota. Ahead of our panel, and to kick off tonight's program, we will have a brief flash talk on the arc of cultural centrality in Seoul, South Korea, given by Carl Friedhoff. Council Fellow in Public Opinion and Asian Policy. I'll return to moderate our Q&A, but until then, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Carl Friedoff.
All right, so thank you to everyone for being here tonight. I'm going to give a very brief talk on what is happening in Seoul. They've been kind enough to put me on a 5-minute clock right up here, so if you see me looking up, that's what I am looking at. Before I joined the council, I spent more than a decade living and working in Seoul, and this is kind of a collection of my thoughts as I've seen the city change over that time. Most recently, I was there in late April, and seeing what had happened after that really kind of solidified what I thought was happening and continued to take place. So this is Seoul. It's a city of 10 million within the city limits itself. And if you count the MSA, it goes up to 25 million. To put that into some perspective, what you see in Chicago is about 2.7 million in the city. And if you expand that, it's about 9.5 million within the MSA. So much larger than Chicago and much older than Chicago as well. So this is, as we look at this through a satellite photo, the title of the slide is A River Now runs through it. That's because when Seoul became the capital in 1392, the river was the southern boundary of the city. The whole city was then concentrated on the north side. Then that basically continues all the way through until the 1970s. Of course, much of the city is destroyed in the 1950s due to the Korean War. But by the time the 1970s comes, they're going to decide that they filled out everything, and now it's time to start moving across the river, something that hadn't really been done before this. This is Gangnam in 1978. So as you can see, this is basically the very first bank of apartment complexes that goes up right on the edge of the river. And at that time, it was largely farmland. So the people who own these apartment buildings are now, they actually cannot be redeveloped. The land is so expensive and the apartments are so extensive that no one has yet found a way to get enough money together to tear them all down and rebuild them. Here's another picture of the area at that time, just to kind of reemphasize. So, and again, these are actually still there, and they're just waiting to be redeveloped at the time. But what has happened during this time is, as the money continued to flow in, the city continued to expand, Gangnam became the hotspot for the entire city. This is Gangnam now. So the pace of development was very rapid. That tall building on the left side of the picture, the glass, is the headquarters of Samsung. And one of the things that really jumps out is the development of the south side, because it was planned, is much more laid out on a grid system. So there are alleys in between there, but if you compare this to the north side of the river, the north side has 1 or 2 main thoroughfares, and then the rest is really back in the alleys where all the action takes place. I often say that Seoul is a great place to live, but a terrible place to visit. Because if you visit, you really miss everything. If you don't know how to get where you're going, they only recently switched back to, or switched their address system. So it used to be in the past you couldn't even find anywhere. So there were no names on the streets. There were no sequential orderings of addresses. So it was a real problem for that time. But also, because it became so expensive, it was pushing out young entrepreneurs. They couldn't really do anything there, and basically Gangnam, in some areas for small businesses, hasn't changed at all in 15 to 20 years. Same shops are still there, and some of them are going out of business, and there's no real economic vitality there. Instead, so this is one of the other parts. So everyone, I'm sure, has seen this. And so this I'm using as a touch point because at this point, this is where we start to see the arc change. If you've seen this music video, part of it is actually a critique of what is happening in Gangnam, that the culture is very front street, it's very conspicuous consumption, and this video is actually criticizing that in a subtle way. And now what we've seen is a return back to the north side of the river. So Gangbuk actually translates literally as North River, or River North, actually. And so if you look at this picture, you can see it's much flatter, much lower, and there really is a giant system of alleys that connects everything. This was done by design during the Joseon dynasty from 1392 through the 1700s, because if you were on the main street, you would have an official riding on a horse coming down, and all the people were expected to stop and bow. So they developed a system of alleys where they could actually go about their daily lives without being interrupted continually. So now that Gangnam is basically off limits, the government has come up with these ways. I got 25 seconds left. The government has come up with these ways to promote young entrepreneurs opening shops here. They're putting in government policy to keep rent control down, and they're doing a very good job of mixed zoning. So there is no real separation like you see here of residential business there. It's all thrown together. And we're seeing really a return to what I call the modern traditional. We're seeing young people rediscover the alleys of Seoul just like they would have done in the past. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our panel to the stage.
All right. So thanks. Welcome, everyone. As she said, I'm Taylor Marr. I work for Redfin as a senior economist. And so tonight we're going to talk about gentrification. So I thought it'd be great if we all understood what gentrification means so that we're all talking about the same thing. So the term gentrification comes from a 1964 essay by researcher Ruth Glass. She defined it as the process of the working class quarters of London being invaded by the middle and upper class, the gentry. She goes on to say, once this process of gentrification starts in a district, it goes on until most of the working class occupiers are displaced and the whole social character is changed. So fundamentally, it's more affluent people are moving in. There's an element of displacement. In my experience in looking at the data at Redfin, oftentimes there's a huge increase in demand for houses in neighborhoods. You see that it's happening all across the country in the biggest cities, in the Arts District in LA. Chicago, there's protests in Pilsen and Woodlawn. People talk about gentrification happening, and then all over the world. So we'll talk about that. So I'll just kick it off to the panel. How does your work intersect with gentrification? How would you guys define it?
Well, I think it's worth noting that, in my experience, I think a lot of times people conflate the words gentrification and displacement, where in my experience, I think gentrification is a form of displacement. You can have displacement without replacing people with higher income residents, and we certainly see that happen throughout neighborhoods in Chicago that are losing population. And I think an example of that, if you think about the plan for transformation to where we tore down large public housing buildings that we had, if you think about some of those buildings became gentrified. Some of those areas became gentrified. Cabrini Green, formerly Cabrini Green, you saw a loss of low-income people, influx of high-income people, and now a bit of a mix of both in the redevelopment. But if you look at Robert Taylor homes on the south side, what you see is displacement without a replacement of folks with higher incomes or at all. So I think it is important to keep in mind that displacement comes in many forms.
Maybe one yes and to that is that there's often this assumption that investment in communities is gentrification. And they are, while gentrification is a form of displacement, gentrification isn't inherently, or investment in communities, investment in resources and access is not in and of itself gentrification. It's when the displacement piece comes into play.
See, these are scholars. I'm just a regular guy. I think of it as something different coming in. And I don't care if that's different forms, levels of income, race. It's something different coming in. And, I think about this as an example. I grew up on 50th and Drexel. You guys are probably too young. Most of you guys are probably too young to remember a street gang called the El Rukins. I grew up right down the street from the El Rukins. It was a rough neighborhood. I moved away, lived in New York, came back, got an MBA. Wow, found this beautiful Greystone over here. I came, bought a Greystone, rehabbed it, and I was told that I was gentrifying the neighborhood, even though it was 2 blocks from where I grew up, right? And so, not necessarily race. It's a different education levels. It's something different coming in into the community that it wasn't your average that was already in the community.
Yeah. So some might say that there's displacement, that's a requirement. I've read some studies that in neighborhoods that were gentrifying in New York or Philly, displacement was very low. But at the same time, I've done research on evictions, and more than 2.5 million people have faced eviction in the last year, or about every year, for several years now. And in Chicago, there's about 30 evictions every day. So there's, it's a huge issue, whereas housing prices are outpacing income and wages. People are being displaced. The question is, where are they going? And are they staying in the same neighborhood? Are they moving at greater rates? I guess, how would you separate out when gentrification is just income or when it's maybe tied to race or other upper class people moving in?
Well, so it's interesting. I got an email today from a friend, and he sent me a video. Hey, look at this. It's interesting. It was talking about white flight. And the second person they interviewed was my grandparents. Now, this was before I was born, right? And they interviewed a little white lady. Oh, black people are moving in. I don't know what's going to happen to the neighborhood. So they moved out. So a lot of what we're talking about right now is people coming back into the city, people utilizing the assets that exist, the transit, proximity to downtown and that kind of thing. And so, I think that when you look at these things, it's kind of saying, hey, it's reversing. These are migration patterns. Things always happen where someone's moving out, someone else is moving back in. But very interestingly, in Chicago, you don't really see gentrification in black neighborhoods, right? Woodlawn is probably the first example that we're starting to really see right now, maybe a little bit South Shore, and in some parts of Bronzeville. But really in Chicago, you see it in the Latino community.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point because in most gentrifying studies, it's all about, are they getting whiter? Are they is there a displacement of black people or even Hispanic people? I think in the from 1960 to 2000, not one neighborhood in Chicago went from majority black to majority white. Oftentimes it's the other way around, and if it's happening. Marisa, what are your thoughts on how this is happening in Chicago with regards to race?
Yeah, well, I think we do have to take a step back and understand our history in this, and Guillen's right to take us back to white flight, and I would even go back a bit further to the start of the Great Migration in 1916. Yeah. Prior to that, we have maps from the Hull House at UIC area where they went door to door and mapped kind of race and ethnicity, and in that time period, it was around the turn of the century, it was quite mixed ethnically. There, all the kind of white immigrants and some African Americans mixed in. But with the start of the Great Migration, you see a much bigger influx of numbers and then a kicking in of, we need to establish a place where these folks will live. Mm-hmm. And that became the Black Belt on the south side, later after World War II, the west side. And what you see there is that white people established a need for a hierarchy and saying, as we, over time then, made redlining illegal, made restrictive covenants illegal, okay, once we've exhausted all of our legal means of doing this, and finally African American families can live where they want to live, well then we'll just move out. And that's the level of kind of fear and entrenched separation that we had created over all those decades. So that I think that's an important history to understand in Chicago. It's not unique to Chicago. I think it's unique to Great Migration legacy cities. Mm-hmm. You don't see that level of segregation in the same way in the South.
Yeah, right.
But I think you see Chicago as a very extreme example of it. And so then when you look around the city today, what you see is we don't have a real history of coexisting in a way that isn't a series of takeovers. We have a handful of communities where you have kind of a longer term, stable mix of folks, from race and income. If you think about Hyde Park, Oak Park, Beverly, Rogers Park, you can kind of count them on one hand, right? Maybe two. What we see for the most part is that we're either majority one race, or if we're a mix, it's because we're moving from one majority to another, right?
Yeah.
And so we did some analysis. We just put out a report last week, and my colleague Alden Lowry did some analysis from 1990 to 2015, and looking at census tracts. Latino census tracts, to your point, were 5 times, majority Latino census tracts in 1990 were 5 times more likely to change their racial majority than African American tracts were.
Wow.
And that's back, there was a 2014 study out of Harvard that said, this is Chicago specific, this is not true of other places, right? Harlem is an example that would not at all follow this pattern, but in Chicago, neighborhoods that are more than 40% African American, but as of 2014, did not gentrify. Now, I think Guiana is an important point. We also have never, though, had a presidential center from the first Black president in a neighborhood before. And I think we're already seeing that may be a big change.
Yeah, and Chicago is unique with its legacy segregation. I mean, we just had 50 years since the Fair Housing Act. The Washington Post a couple weeks ago put out this report on segregation and diversity. America is now more diverse than ever, but more segregated. And it's especially true in Chicago, where there's that legacy of housing policies. In other cities that are newer, it's slightly more integrated. Tim, I'd like to ask you, how do you see integrated communities, both with income, but also with race?
Yeah, I like how you frame that, Marisa, because there are so many different pieces that have happened so sort of beautifully, and by beautifully I mean horribly, that have gotten Chicago to where it is. From policy positions that allowed us to have opinions based on race, while really overarchingly talking about responding to Great Migration. And then we codify them, we shift them, and we create these structures that limit mobilization. And then we look back at, a century of those limits now means that you can't undo all of that in one fell swoop, and we're trying to respond to that. As was touched earlier by Carl, this reality, and Brittany as well, this reality that the mass urban migration that the UN Habitat is tracking, right? This massive influx into the city. It's not really into the city, which is kind of interesting, right? Again, to your point, there's this inversion of the city, right? So now, to find a place to live affordably is measured on the distance from the center point that you actually have to get to.
Yeah, right.
And in many cities, and we'll use Atlanta for example, the density in downtown Atlanta is the hottest, sexiest place in Atlanta, and you've got to drive an hour or 2 or 3 to find an affordable community. So we're getting these sort of inverted rings that start to happen. That starts to happen in a lot of global cities that are trying to respond in real time to this. Carl talked a little bit to his example, but even the cities that are the burgeoning cities, right? So living in the Middle East and watching the distance that labor camps had. So when I say labor camps, I mean the workforce that drives a vast majority of a city. The distances traveled to be part of that city. And we struggle with this, I think, as a society, that density, there is this sort of fine line between, if we were to create more density, we could respond to that. We can mix in maybe a little different way. But this sort of economic self-segregation usually has racial undertones or ethnic undertones or have and have not undertones that have limited our sort of moving past it. Chicago's a good example of that, because we now sit in this space where, I don't know, I would half imagine that example, the sort of the Latino community is 5 times more, for better and for worse, reflects where those communities have been and these sort of takeovers, but also reflects potentially underlying tones that suggest a transition from Latino to a white community is maybe more comfortable for people than moving into an historically Black community. And we don't like to say that out loud, actually, but that's probably the reality that we see here.
Yeah, and even in the study that Marisa cited with the neighborhoods being no more than 40% Black, they oftentimes also were at least 35% white. So, if gentrification is upper class white people moving in, then of course, if there are no other whites in the neighborhood, then you might be less likely to move there. So we talked about displacement. Certainly racial displacement is a big one. What are these negative impacts from gentrification that we see?
I think you lose some of the flavor of a neighborhood, right?
Yeah.
You lose some of the flavor. Where could you go get good, authentic Puerto Rican food in Lincoln Park? You young people, you didn't even know Lincoln Park was a Puerto Rican neighborhood. When I was growing up, you went to the zoo, Lincoln Park was a Puerto Rican neighborhood. I just left Miami today, and because of, migration patterns, either forced or people made a choice to come from Cuba to what we now call Little Havana, that was a neighborhood of Haitians. That was a neighborhood of Bahamians, right? And so, but you had a huge influx in a very short period of time. And so now, how do those communities start to coexist? Maybe it's not as many Haitians as it is Jamaicans, so do they start to blend? So I think one of the repercussions is you lose some of the flavor. People don't figure out what they have in common rather than they focus on the differences, what they have rather than what they have in common. And I think that when you look at the Latino community on the Southwest side where I work, language becomes one of those things that hold people together.
Yeah.
And so if people start to spread out, now my kid doesn't speak Spanish growing up, right? And so there could be a lot of consequences that could come from that. But I think that it, in my opinion, it further kind of widens the gap between us knowing each other.
Yeah, so it also maybe more racial tensions in neighborhoods that are a small racial minority might feel they're being pushed out.
Right.
There might be increased racial tensions that could spread to other areas.
And I wonder that, it becomes a sort of very specific economic conversation. Those ethnic tensions happened in Chicago when they were both Northern European settlements that were sort of fighting for the land and the property. We sort of cling to and sometimes self-segregate based on the language that we would like our families to speak or whatever it might be. But seems to be the more successful integrated communities focus more on a cross-pollination economically, right? So a economically diverse community, I don't know if it's because they're more progressive and sort of comfortable with it, but it seems that economically diverse communities tend to also have healthier mixes.
Yeah, and it promotes economic mobility. I know a lot of research has shown, especially in the last year, where mixed income neighborhoods, see a lot more improvement with access to jobs, opportunities. Just having that diversity can open up a lot of opportunities, especially for lower income households. So if they're always displaced, then you're kind of segregating and isolating a lot of opportunity. There's a lot of missed opportunity there.
I think there's a real cost to the fact that as a city and in parts of the region, that we haven't figured out better how to coexist across lines of race and income. We haven't figured out how to stabilize communities, and I think then what happens is there's always an incredible fear and distrust of change, and understandably so, because of the history that we've had. And one example, just from my life, my husband and I moved into North Lawndale in 2002, and we bought a house on the southern end of North Lawndale. So for people who don't know, North Lawndale is a predominantly African-American neighborhood just to the north of a predominantly Mexican-American neighborhood. And we were on the south end, so we were just like 2 blocks from Little Village. And after a couple weeks, my block club president says to me, well, did you notice that people weren't being very nice to you? And I said, no. Why? She said, don't worry, I fixed it. I told them you're white. And I said, how does that fit? What did they think I was? She said, oh, they thought you were Mexican, but we're all good now. And I thought, so me being white is just kind of random at that point, rather than threatening. Yeah. But had it been an incursion, seen from the South, but, so think about that as so the barriers there that go up out of a real fear of we don't peacefully coexist, because that's not been our history as a city.
Well, you could look at it another way. If a white person moved on my block, I would feel like, man, the police are gonna come faster when they're called, the street lights are gonna get fixed, the potholes are gonna get fixed, the schools are gonna get better, because that's if it snows, you come out to my neighborhood on the southwest side, man, you would think you lived in Alaska. You come downtown or to Lincoln Park, it looked like it never snowed. Like they moved the snow over to my part of town. So, there's some benefit to white people moving in. It's probably what your neighbors were thinking.
Personally, I didn't see any difference, but, well, I think that's actually a really interesting point, because I have had, this just happened a couple weeks ago, there was speaking at some thing, and there was a white woman in the crowd who was just moving to Chicago, and she said, well, where can I go that I won't be a gentrifier? And as I thought about it, I thought, I think it's important as white people not to overstate our importance or You know, I lived in North Lawndale for 12 years. I didn't gentrify squat.
Right.
You know, like we still own our house because it's underwater. Like what I did do was become a member of the Black Club and become a member of Lawndale Community Church, and you know, all of those things that make you part of a neighborhood. But I didn't single-handedly transform anything, nor did I think I would by
Right.
being there.
Right, and again, this is where I go back to the definition of something different coming in, right? Because you bring your sets of experiences, I bring my sets of experiences, and hopefully we're doing it for the better, to improve the community, right? And so hopefully that's the way that it works out.
Yeah, that defensive posture of if you were coming in from the south, and that's radically changing, going to a sort of something different's all right. I don't know that we're comfortable as a society saying that something different's all right, that you're going to bring something that I'm not going to bring and vice versa. And that's couched in decades and frankly centuries of mistrust and no structure in place to allow it.
Yeah, I'm sorry to make all these examples, Chicago-specific examples. We kind of talked a little bit, right? Cabrini Green. It's not the same Cabrini Green that it was 20 years ago. And there were no resources going into the schools in Cabrini Green. And now, look, now the white people live in the neighborhood, there's resources. So if I lived in Cabrini Green my whole life, I'm saying, well, wait a minute. Why didn't you fix the school when it was just my kids there, right? And so it brings about all of these other issues that are kind of tucked away that nobody wants to talk about. But these are the real issues, I think, when we talk about gentrification that we really have to talk about. And again, it could be race, but I think it could even be like me moving back into the community that I grew up in. It's an income level at that point.
Yeah, so there certainly, you know, spillover effects. There are benefits that the community, the existing residents might benefit from. Who doesn't benefit from gentrification in the neighborhood?
I think the most vulnerable people, right? So if you, you know, first layer is if you're a renter and you don't have protections on your, you know, it's not a long-term affordable unit. But even if you're a homeowner and your taxes go up exponentially, that may not, you know, so, and then you may say, well, hey, you know, Cabrini got a Starbucks and a grocery store, and they may all be at things that aren't the amenities that people maybe want or can afford. Et cetera. And I think fundamentally, though, to Guillaume's point, there's a sense of a loss of culture. And when we look at studies from public housing redevelopments, now nobody would argue that they should have been left the way they were, but I think you do have to acknowledge a loss of community that comes with the redevelopment that occurred, and that people, the consistent thing people reported with the studies that have been done since then is, yes, I appreciate that there's less crime, and I appreciate, you know, some of the amenities, but I miss the community that I had, and I don't know my neighbors, and I frankly don't really want to, and you know, this is a loss. This is a tangible loss to me, and I think we can't, you know, we can't underestimate what that means in people's lives.
Because those acts are not additive. They're not adding to the community. Oftentimes in those transitions, it's some of the public housing is kept, much of it is sent somewhere else or scattered in many different places. And in Chicago, sometimes as far as Rockford, wherever the bus can take that individual. And so you're destroying the community that gave the value to the community. I don't know.
Which that being scattered can be a good thing, as we talked about with economic mobility. If people are integrated into better neighborhoods, we don't want to concentrate poverty. And certainly, you know, if people are having improved home values, that can be good. But yeah, if they can't afford it, majority of people in gentrified neighborhoods are renters, and they're being you know, priced out or have higher rental burdens.
But to that point, there's the mobility sort of, which is self-selective versus the scattering, which one has no. So there's one that is actually a dignified move because the person's a human being, make a decision for themselves, and the other is a scattering that de-dignifies or sort of removes that as a structure.
Yeah. So, you know, I mean, I think that there's probably a lot of fancy research words we can use, but I think at the end of the day, it boils down to decisions that individuals make, right? If I made a decision to mentor some kids who grew up in public housing that lived a couple of blocks away from me, and ended up getting one kid a full scholarship to Morehouse College, a job at Goldman Sachs, but I made that decision. I make the decision, even at my age now, to still shovel the two, seniors snow, right? I made that decision, and I mentor young men and young women at different schools. And there's something to be said about even the people who live in public housing a couple of blocks away from me or Section 8 across the street from me, for them to see me getting up and going to work every day, learning what I do, learning what the people who I work with, what they do. There's some benefit for me learning from them. Like, honestly, I would have had no idea of how important it was to have insurance, because I've always had insurance, until I talked to a family who didn't have insurance, who couldn't eat, and now that gave me a different perspective, right? So I think we kind of all lose if we don't really work to make this thing work together.
Yeah, and so the title of tonight's talk is The Good, the Bad, and the Hipsters. And so you mentioned a point of gentrification can be driven by individual actions. Maybe a bunch of hipsters choose to go into a neighborhood, because there's a good coffee shop. Then as more and more people start to move in, this process happens. Oftentimes, millennials who are working at tech companies and very affluent, certainly they are the gentrifiers. But also millennials are struggling with, rising student debt, struggling with housing affordability, with rapid rising housing prices. It's really hard to enter into homeownership for millennials who are starting families. So are the millennials or the hipsters, are they individual actions that are leading to this gentrification, or is there also an element of top-down?
Man, I don't want to do all the talking. But those the same people, the hipsters and the unemployed people, it's the same thing. Neither one can afford to live.
Right.
It's the same thing.
Yeah.
Tim, can you talk about that with affordable housing, with...
We're calling them the hipsters now because that is the word that we use, but that is based on another word that described a bohemian lifestyle that invested in arts and culture and in transitional neighborhoods. And I wonder, in the subject of gentrification and the concern as to whether or not a hipster, as it were, is being gentrified out of a community, sort of separates out the conversation that suggests that they aren't upwardly mobile in and of themselves. So being gentrified out of a community because of an entry-level position is not the same as being gentrified out of a community because you've been working 1 or 2 or 3 jobs for decades. And so we've got to sort of balance that. We have to get comfortable with that a little bit. But the bigger wonder that I have, and we've used these words like affordable housing, which in Chicago, affordable housing is really, frankly, it's workforce development housing. This is not serving the public need and serving the sort of the base condition of Maslow's hierarchy. This is 60 to 100% AMI in Chicago. So you're talking somebody who's making $35,000, $40,000 a year qualifies for affordable housing, which in the grand scheme of things, we're doing something wrong if we have to categorically subsidize housing conditions to make them accessible at whatever budget level one exists at. There is a big wonder that I have as we start to have these conversations is, what are the things that we're doing wrong if housing is not accessible for where people, to meet people where they are? And we do have to put additional structures in place to get them there.
Yes, which is a whole bunch of the work that Gian and I and others are involved in, absolutely. I think there is, I'm just going to pick up on one thing, and I know we have to go to Q&A soon, but that I think is important, and it kind of gets, this is about small actions and attitudes, but it kind of gets to this woman's question to me about how do I as a white person do this? And some of it I think has to do with a fundamental mindset. Now, when you were just talking, what you talked about was a two-way exchange of value, right? Mm-hmm. It's not just, oh, it's important for them to see me going to work. It's also, I learned things from them. I am part of this community and they are too. And I think that's a fundamental orientation that if you are joining a neighborhood that has long existed before you and has ways of doing things, you need to come in with that mindset of respect and learning that you have to do as well. And I think we talked about this a little ahead of time. I mean, I think there's a very important role to play for the media in this too, because I feel like this is often covered in a really, really disrespectful way, right? Recently, it was a good article, but was an article that was talking about investments on the South and West Side, and the article itself was fine, but the subtitle was, "Can the South and West Side be rescued?" or something. But it was like, no, South and West Side need investment that they have been deprived for decades. That's the conversation. It's not rescue. I have one. I went back and found this because this one made me mad. This is from February 2016. Few considered living south of Armitage Avenue and west of Kedzie before the 606. Few except for all of the people who lived there for 100 years, right? This is Columbus
syndrome. A large majority
syndrome.
of the city, yeah.
Yeah, this is, I mean, so I think just being aware as individuals and calling out, the media calling out, however this gets framed as disrespectful and colonizing is, I think, needs to be part of the conversation.
And what about in other countries? I lived in Berlin for a while, and I know there's, just last month, there were 13,000 people protesting in the neighborhood of Kreuzberg over gentrification. Rents are rising really rapidly there, which was once a very affordable capital of Europe. And on a global scale, gentrification is happening in all cities. Not in my hometown of Sioux City, Iowa, but certainly it's happening in these large cities. I know you guys have lived abroad as well. What is your experience?
I like the word that you used, because that was one of the fundamental reasons we left Chicago. We moved to the Middle East because I felt like a colonizing designer, somehow bringing the gift of Western wisdom to the folks who live in the Middle East, and I was doing it all wrong. Frankly, you can't fly in on an overnight flight and provide any semblance of structure. And when we moved to the Middle East and then we moved to India, it was really about, all right, if these are the places that I'm working, there's more coming this way, to Gan's point, than me providing. I am not providing expertise. It's frankly a sort of learning opportunity. And in many, the cities that I feel are getting it right are understanding that it is bidirectional. The cities that would like to supplant or replace existing culture with whatever the 21st century version of that is for that place, that's where we're seeing those sort of tensions. And to your example in Berlin, I know you've lived in other places as well, this notion that it's the same stuff we talked about all evening. The entrenched culture that have been around for a long time starts to get uncomfortable when another culture shows up and has any sort of position or say.
That's right. I was a German Marshall Fund fellow in 2014, and with that program, you spend 3.5 weeks, I think, in 5 different cities in Europe, and it's a really eye-opening thing to have been immersed in all the negatives of your own country, and then you go other places and you're like, oh, we don't have a lock on doing this wrong. And it was eye-opening to me that as much as, when I think about our history and I think about how so much happened in this country at a time when we were so racist and sexist, and we put things in motion, that I had this notion that, boy, if, for European countries maybe that are just now experiencing an influx of people different from them, they may be at a more evolved place and able to do this better. And I still hold out hope for that, but there is a real negative to millennia of being a homogenous tribe as well, right? And so I think there's just a lot to learn from the transatlantic
I mean, hypothetically,
experience.
there are political parties in certain countries that believe that the immigrants are causing their countries to sink underwater. So we do not, to your point, we do not have a lock on this. It's it's fundamental to the human condition that we try to separate and isolate, while at the same time try to create community and come together.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone, for this fantastic conversation. We're not done yet. We're going to transition to Q&A, and I hopped up here really quickly because we have a ton of questions, and I want an opportunity for our panel to answer as many questions as possible. We're going to take some questions from in the room. There are council staff walking around with microphones. Please just raise your hand, wait for a microphone, and as always, please make sure your question is actually a question. And then we also will continue to take questions from our online survey. So I'm going to start right up here on the right with Dustin.
Hi, can you talk about the role of public transit and how it's a solution for the poor and economic disparity and also a desire for the affluent nowadays?
You're perfect.
Yeah, you have to be. You set you up. That's good.
Yeah, right. Well, Guion and I work together on a project called Elevated Chicago that is organizing around 7 transit stations across the city, very much out of the belief that these are assets fundamental to our city and our region. I mean, I think cities that are growing in their transit and investing around transit nodes. And I think that's something that we need to, as a city, a couple years ago, we strengthened our transit-oriented development ordinance. We now have incentives to include more affordability. We have incentives to include more density near transit. I think these are things that allow us to have more of a mix of incomes near an incredibly important asset, and to really treat that land differently than we treat, something 3 blocks away. And I think we have to get in this mindset, right? We would not plop a Target on the beach, right? Because the beach is a public benefit to the entire city. In the same way, we need to think differently and think about the land that surrounds transit and really think about that as spaces where we create affordability deliberately, we create options for neighborhood-based retail deliberately. These are things that, particularly in a neighborhood where there's been disinvestment, where people have had a very hard time accessing credit to start their own business or to thrive as a business owner, you can really leverage a denser building to help write down some of the rents on the first floor. And these are things we should be doing just as a matter of course, right? And we've seen some improvements in that with the city's Neighborhood Opportunity Fund and so on.
But I think that in order to view something as an asset, you have to be able to utilize it, right? So in the case of transit, I can go to Wicker Park, and because of the density, because the jobs, the access to downtown, it's an asset. You come to Inglewood, where there's high unemployment, where am I taking the train to? Right, I don't have a job to go take a train to. If I live out in Argyle Gardens and there is no train to get me all the way out there, it's not an asset, much like the beach is a great asset. Well, you guys stay on the north side at the beach. The south side beaches are empty, right? Because it's a different set of challenges that people have. And then when I have a friend from the north side, he comes south, he's like, wow, this is incredible. So much space.
Front row right here on the left.
Hi, thanks for being here. 2 related questions. I'll try to be brief. The first is, how do you differentiate what is observed as gentrification as opposed to the fact that neighborhoods over the course of decades or centuries just naturally change? A good example of this, I think, an acclaimed book about Cabrini Green came out earlier this year that talks about it, once being an Italian slum, then becoming the projects of Cabrini Green, and today it is what it is. Neighborhoods change. Second question is, a camp of economists sort of believes that income inequality is perpetuated by the fact that people are so isolated. The wealthy and the poor don't interact. They have their own spaces and so on and so forth. And yet, I find this hard to reconcile with neighborhoods like Bucktown or Logan Square or Wicker Park. These are among the few parts of the city where you can see a $6 million condo next to a working class immigrant family. Comments
Super
on both,
quick
please.
on both of those.
Yeah, so your first point, I agree with wholly, right? Ben Austin's book was incredible. It kind of talks about it. I think that neighborhoods do change. I think that city planners are not intentional about planning for that change. So if that infrastructure is not in place, if there's no school when one group moves in and the next group is moving to the next neighborhood, if there's no school, it's a problem. You end up with overcrowded schools. So, I think that is a part of the challenge that we have. I think we have to think a little bit more long-term about migration patterns of people.
I would challenge you a bit on the notion that all change is organic. I think, yes, neighborhoods change, cities change. All of that is true. But if you read the book, The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein, the amount of machinations that have gone into the creation of who can live where, you will never again think that anything happened organically when you look around the city. Really, and so it's a frustration for me because some of the work we've been doing as we've looked at some of the costs of segregation and then what are the things you do about them, has been some pushback I've gotten is like, this is social engineering. People should just live where they want to live. Well, everything, when you look around us today, everything you see was socially engineered. It was set up this way, and we need to be deliberate about providing people as many choices as possible. It won't just happen organically.
Yeah, there are often massive millions of dollars of incentives to developers for very specific regions that, very deliberate policies in place as to who is going to benefit.
Danielle, black shirt on the left right there.
So I wanted to come from a totally different perspective, a little bit more going back to the global cities aspect, and wanted to know how you would reconcile kind of the total opposite. So what we see, for example, in Rio, where it's the lower middle class coming in and taking over the city and building over what we would call the white European descendant upper class people. And that doesn't also, be the total opposite. If we're looking at gentrification at the negatives, that also doesn't necessarily bring positives because people are being displaced. People, the prices doesn't change, it's still very high prices, and now people who are used to living in their homes cannot live there anymore because they are so dangerous, because now it becomes a slum and it's all about drugs and it's not livable anymore. So it's a completely different, what if that were to happen type of idea. And I'm curious to see what insight, you from different perspectives you would have.
So it's awesome because I just got this email today. It was WBBM special. My grandparents, they were the first black people to move into a community in Avalon Park called Mary Nook. And they interviewed someone, I don't know what's gonna happen if the black people live next door. And so en masse, the white people moved out, which left an opportunity for the black people to move in. But if the income levels were different, or if the resources weren't put into that community or stayed at that same level, of course the neighborhood is gonna fall into disrepair, right? The schools are gonna get worse if you're not putting those same resources in it that you did. So it's kind of the same thing, right? It's this migration pattern, but it happened because of humans' fear. What's gonna happen if the middle class move in? I'm gonna move out, right? And at some point, they're gonna wanna be back in the city, and we're gonna be having the gentrification question in Rio.
Yep.
We're gonna be talking about the same thing.
I would skip even sort of a little bit away from Rio over to Medellin in Colombia, where what you've actually seen is, to Gan's point, actual investment for the people that have lived in those communities for a long time, providing transportation access, home ownership, even when their homes are barely considered homes and frankly do not comply to any code in Medellin. But the commitment to this is your home now and this is your community and we're going to support you as a municipality to get you there. Job creation to change the course it becomes less about what's actually happening on the ground there. And I guess what we see in Medellin and the transition over the past 2 decades is radical reinvestment in their most important sort of human capital, and to say what can we do when we treat everybody, when to the research that the MPC has done, actually unlock the economic potential of the community when you start to dignify and level set what it means to be a city.
Right here on the left. Wait for the mic.
To kind of ground this, could you each talk about a project that you're working on right now, professionally, that has some kind of positive effect on the city in this respect?
Yeah, I'll go. We're doing a lot of work right now to understand and frankly shift an industry which is about building buildings in its scattershot sort of way into something a little bit more in line with innovation and progress. And what I mean by that is that for CHA, for example, Chicago Housing Authority, it costs between $350,000 and $400,000 to deliver a 2-bedroom, 2-bath unit. That's not at all what it actually costs to build. That's just what it costs once we start to layer all the different pieces of subsidy and structure to create an affordable unit. We're really focusing on a commitment that gets us in a few years to a place where by manufacturing and increasing the quality of housing, we can insert it into communities that most need it, and at the same time drastically reduce the cost to build buildings so that we can get to a place where affordable housing, the word affordable is a irrelevant term in the grand scheme of things, because it is housing that meets the budgetary opportunities that those families have.
So last week, we, Metropolitan Planning Council released about 24 recommendations to create a more racially equitable region. One of them was around the creation of a community impact assessment tool. And the idea would be that as communities are seeing the likelihood of an investment, right? We think about things we learned from the 606 and think about things like the Paseo in Pilsen or the Presidential Center in Woodlawn. When you know that something is coming, how do we more proactively understand likely impacts and begin to plan for those much more ahead of time, both as a community and then so giving the community more information and then trying to push on the political will front and the investment front from on the part of government and the private sector.
I'm just going to be controversial. I own a lot of land in one of the neighborhoods pretty close to the Obama Presidential Center. So there's some forces that want a community benefits agreement. There's some that don't want a community benefits agreement. And I'm on the side of I don't want the community benefits agreement. I don't want the community benefits agreement to only be at the Obama Presidential Center stage. If we're going to do a CBA, I want to see it across the city. When I walk downtown and I go to a construction site and it's lunchtime, I don't see any black faces. And so how do we expect crime to improve in our neighborhoods if nobody has a job in our neighborhood? So I don't just want it just for Woodlawn or South Shore or Washington Park. If we're going to do a CBA, I want it for the whole city.
Taylor?
Well, I'm not a developer, so I'm not working on any projects in that regard. But we did develop this tool at Redfin called Opportunity Score, and it allows a lot of data that shows access to good jobs within a 30-minute commute. So people aren't commuting 90 minutes to just get a good job. And you can see that all across the city, especially with regards to infrastructure, to what you were talking about earlier, the places that have the highest opportunity are definitely ones that are close to transit, where you can have lots of jobs. And it goes along with where developers should be building housing. There's a huge housing shortage. We need to build thousands and thousands of more houses than we are right now as a country. And but the question is, where do we place those with opening up opportunity for people to get those jobs?
So two of the top most voted on questions are very related here. One, why do we always criticize Chicago and other cities for being segregated but reject gentrification? And then related to that, and we've talked a little bit about this, in what concrete ways can gentrification be positive for a community? Is it always negative?
So I agree with the first part. This is the place where I have a fundamental problem with it. I mean, I understand the displacement part, right? So I'm not cheering for displacement, but I do think that that's a part of the problem, especially here in Chicago. When I lived in New York, my building was the UN, and you don't have a lot of neighborhoods in Chicago where that happens. So that's on that side. On the other part about the positive side, I lived in New York in the mid-90s. My best buddy lived in Bed-Stuy. And, people at the office would tell me, don't go to Bed-Stuy, whatever you do, don't go to Bed-Stuy. Well, the Bed-Stuy of today is not the Bed-Stuy of 95. He was able to sell his building, move to Delaware, moved his whole family down to Delaware, bought a company, bought a house, employed 3 guys from Delaware, who came from Brooklyn to move down to Delaware. He would say gentrification saved his life.
Yeah.
Right? It totally changed his life. Now, for his tenants, they didn't get the same kind of benefit, right? But it certainly had a positive impact on that family and, the surrounding family.
A similar experience in New York. The building was a UN, both sort of ethnically and from sort of age and economic, because of the rent control that actually exists in New York. So I was living in this building with people that had lived there for 20, 30, 60 years because there were structures in place that allowed them to live there as the neighborhood shift and flux, which does happen. I wonder in Chicago, I think, for example, the massive TIF funding for a new Green Line station at Damon, and I wonder what it would actually take to use a portion of that TIF funds to create sort of transitional tax shelters for long-term homeowners that live in those neighborhoods, so that it is not that immediate change. And frankly, so that is one in a myriad of steps that we can take to get rid of some of the remnants of the Revenue Act of the 50s that still allow people to lose their entire homes for missed tax payments. So there are structures in place that allows, I wouldn't call it gentrification as a good thing. I would actually just call it investment in jobs and schools and transportation and access to allow sort of an equally mobile society, those that are moving in and those that can actually remain within those communities.
Yeah. I'm fundamentally befuddled by that first question. Like, why do we bemoan segregation yet bemoan gentrification? Well, because fundamentally, gentrification is about displacing people. So, yeah, so what I think, the way I would think about that question is, if we're fundamentally bemoaning the state of segregation, why can't we as a city and as a region figure out how to create stable places where all kinds of people can live? Right. That, to me, is the question, and I don't know why we're this bad at it. I mean, I've spent some time working on this. And I will continue to. I mean, I think there are things we can do better and that we will do better, but that is a fundamental challenge to this city and this region.
I think part of the answer is, and not just Chicago, but a lot of places, right? I was an investment banker before, right? And so I'm going to invest in the things that I'm comfortable with, the things that I know. If you ask me to invest in biotech or cryptocurrency, I don't understand it, so no, right? So if I'm the decision maker on do I put a grocery store in this neighborhood, if I don't understand a black neighborhood or a Latino neighborhood, I'm never putting the grocery store there because I don't understand it. I'm not gonna risk my job taking a chance to put it in some place that I don't understand, right? And so one of the positive things I think that comes from it is you say, oh, wow, look, Marissa moved into, what was the neighborhood again?
Lawndale.
Into Lawndale, wow. Maybe they need a grocery store, right? And it makes people look at it a different way. And so I think that that's one of the things that why having, I'm not you specifically, but you're just sitting here next to me. But I think that that's a part of it. I had a conversation with Magic Johnson about this. And I asked him the question of, man, you have movie theaters and restaurants and Starbucks. Why don't you do more? And he said to me that he has the same fight that every other developer who works in minority communities have. He has to convince the decision makers who don't understand those communities.
I want to throw in there too, and you touched on a little bit this notion that we as a city, you're doing it personally. A lot of people in this room are probably doing it personally. Investing in a belief that if there are opportunity paths created for individuals, that individuals will take those opportunity paths, right? The mentors and the mentees that you've had. I wonder what, as a city, we can do if we leverage the talent in this room, and frankly, the talent that's within, let's say, 2,000 feet of each one of us sitting here, to create additional alternative paths to opportunity, to job training, to exposure. Because you talk a lot about a lot of people, we're risk adverse. We don't invest in the things that we don't know about. And so what does it actually take to know more about the people that we have in our city? Because the more you know about your community, the more you get involved in your community. And that's not because you live in Lawndale. That's because you live in a community of people. That's kind of how all of us.
Which is also why stability is so important. If
Right.
people are constantly being displaced because they can't afford rent and they're moving from neighborhood to neighborhood, they're not going to get to know their neighborhood.
Right.
They're not going to get to know their neighbors, which I think is one of the positive things of owning a home, being rooted in a place. You're invested and you want the welfare of your community because you're going to benefit from it too.
But I think it still goes back to what you talked about with media too, right? Yeah. I had a group of 15 interns from Ohio 2 weeks ago, and I asked them, how tough was it, all white, middle of Ohio, how tough was it for you to get your parents to agree to let you come intern here? They were like, man, it almost didn't happen. And I said, now, is this neighborhood what you saw on TV, what you saw on CNN and when you read? Absolutely not. It's not perfect neighborhood, but it's not a war zone. And so I think that that's a part of it too, the messages that we get from the media, it makes that battle even harder.
Our panel has a lot of opinions. They have a lot of expertise. They're going to stick around for a few minutes. We're going to get them a drink. The bar is going to open soon. We encourage you, if you can, to stick around and ask any remaining questions. Unfortunately, we don't have time for any more public questions, but please join me in thanking our fantastic panel for this conversation.